Sign over Grandpa's estate or face court, little bloodless sis." Caroline's voice cut through my office like a blade, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany conference table. 4 lawyers flanked her, their briefcases open and documents spread across the surface like weapons of war. "My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and I'm 35 years old. I run a successful architectural firm in Portland, Oregon, where I've spent the last decade designing sustainable buildings and managing complex construction projects. But none of that mattered to my sister Caroline in this moment. What mattered was that our grandfather Winston had died 3 days ago, and she was here to claim what she believed was rightfully hers." I set down my coffee and studied the papers they'd thrust at me. The inheritance waiver was thorough. I had to give them credit. It would sign away any claims I might have to Winston's estate, leaving Caroline as the sole beneficiary of what everyone assumed was a $5 million fortune. The house in Lake Oswego, the vintage car collection, the investment portfolio that had sustained him through retirement. "You always knew this day would come," Caroline continued, her blue eyes cold as winter. "Winston might have pretended to love his little adopted granddaughter, but blood is blood. The courts will see reason when they understand you're not really family." One of her lawyers, a stern man with silver hair, leaned forward. "Miss Mitchell, this is a generous offer. Your sister could contest the will based on biological precedents, but she's willing to avoid litigation if you simply acknowledge the natural order of inheritance." I reached for my tea kettle, the familiar ritual calming my nerves. Caroline had always underestimated me, even when we were children. She saw adoption as a weakness, a mark of being unwanted. She never understood that Winston had chosen me, had seen something in a frightened 8-year-old girl that made him fight to bring me into his family despite Caroline's mother's objections. "Would anyone like tea?" I asked pleasantly, rising to prepare the service. "I have some excellent Earl Grey that Winston brought back from his last trip to London." Caroline's face flushed with irritation. "This isn't a social visit, Rebecca. Sign the papers." I poured hot water over the tea leaves, watching the amber liquid swirl in the delicate china cups. Winston had taught me this ritual during countless afternoons in his study, where he'd shared stories of his travels and business ventures. Those conversations had been more valuable than Caroline could ever imagine. "Of course," I said finally, returning to my seat with the tea service. "I understand completely. You want to finalize everything quickly, settle the estate without complications." I smiled warmly at the lawyers, noting how they shifted uncomfortably under Caroline's expectant gaze. "I'll make sure everything is properly handled tomorrow morning." Caroline's tension visibly eased, mistaking my calm for surrender. She had no idea that tomorrow morning would bring revelations that would shatter everything she thought she knew about our grandfather's true wealth. The years leading up to this moment had been filled with subtle signs that Caroline chose to ignore. While she focused on her social life and spending Winston's money on designer clothes and expensive vacations, I had quietly built a relationship with our grandfather that went far beyond family dinners and holiday visits. It started when I was in college, studying architecture at the University of Oregon. Winston had mentioned during one of our weekly coffee meetings that he was considering some property investments in Europe. His eyes lit up when I showed genuine interest in the market analysis and urban planning aspects of real estate development. "Most people see buildings as just structures," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "But you understand that they're part of a larger tapestry, connected to economics and culture and human needs." That conversation led to another, and then another. Soon I was helping him research international markets, analyzing property values in London, Barcelona, and Singapore. Caroline never paid attention to these discussions when they happened during family gatherings. She was too busy checking her phone or complaining about her latest relationship drama. "Rebecca's always been such a little bookworm," she'd say dismissively when Winston tried to include her in our conversations about overseas investments. "I don't understand why you bother with all those boring business talks." Winston would catch my eye across the dinner table, and I'd see something flicker there. Disappointment, maybe. or recognition of something fundamental about Caroline's character that he was only beginning to fully understand. The real turning point came 2 years ago, during Caroline's birthday party. She'd demanded an expensive celebration at the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Portland, insisting that Winston pay for her friends' meals and drinks. When the bill arrived, she didn't even look at the total before sliding it across the table to him. "Thanks, Grandpa," she'd said breezily. "You're the best." Later that evening, as I helped Winston to his car, he'd been unusually quiet. "She's never even asked about my health," he said finally. "Never wondered if I'm managing financially. Never offered to help with anything. She just assumes the money will always be there." I'd driven him home that night, and we'd talked for hours in his study. He'd shown me documents I'd never seen before. Property deeds and trust agreements that painted a picture of wealth far beyond what any of us had imagined. The domestic assets Caroline knew about were just the tip of the iceberg. "I've been thinking about the future," Winston had said, his voice thoughtful. "About what legacy really means, and who truly understands the responsibility that comes with wealth." Over the following months, those conversations became more frequent and more detailed. Winston began sharing the full scope of his international holdings, explaining how he'd quietly built a global real estate portfolio worth over $20 million. Properties in London's financial district, luxury developments in Barcelona, commercial buildings in Singapore's business center. "Caroline sees money as something to spend," he'd observed one afternoon. "But you understand that wealth is a tool for creating something lasting." The transformation in our relationship had been gradual but profound. What started as investment discussions evolved into something much deeper. Winston was preparing me to inherit not just his wealth, but his vision for how that wealth should be used. 6 months before his death, Winston had called me to his study for what he described as an important conversation. The room was lined with legal documents, and his attorney, James Crawford, was present via video conference from London. "Rebecca," Winston had begun, his voice steady, despite his declining health, "I need you to understand something about your sister that I've been reluctant to acknowledge." He'd pulled out a folder containing printed emails and text messages. Caroline's communications with him over the past year, all focused on money. Requests for shopping trips, demands for vacation funding, complaints about her credit card limits. Not once had she asked about his well-being or expressed gratitude for anything beyond the financial support. "She sent me this last week," Winston said, showing me Caroline's latest message. It was a terse demand for advance inheritance money to buy a new car, written with the casual entitlement of someone ordering coffee. She doesn't even sign it with love. The contrast was stark when he showed me my own messages from the same period. Questions about his doctor's appointments, offers to help with grocery shopping, thank you notes for advice he'd given me about work challenges. The difference in tone and content was unmistakable. "I've made some decisions," Winston had said, sliding a thick stack of documents across his desk. "The international properties, the offshore accounts, the real estate trusts I've built over the past 15 years. They're all being transferred to you." I'd stared at the papers in shock. Property deeds for buildings in London worth millions, trust documents for commercial developments in Barcelona, investment portfolios managed through Singapore banks. The scope was staggering. "Winston, I can't accept this," I'd protested. "It's too much. Caroline is your biological granddaughter." His expression had hardened. "Biology doesn't determine character, Rebecca. You've shown me respect, genuine care, and understanding of responsibility. Caroline has shown me that she views me as a bank account with legs." James Crawford had explained the legal structures Winston had carefully constructed. The domestic assets, the visible wealth that Caroline knew about, would go to her through the traditional will. But the international holdings, the real wealth, had already been transferred to me through a complex series of offshore trusts and foreign corporations. "This has been planned for 3 years," Crawford had explained. "Every transfer was legal, documented, and structured to withstand any challenge. Caroline's lawyers will find nothing irregular about the domestic inheritance, because it follows standard probate procedures. As I'd left Winston's house that evening, documents safely locked in my briefcase, he'd squeezed my hand. "You're the granddaughter of my heart," he'd said quietly. "Blood doesn't make family. Love and respect do." Now, sitting in my office with Caroline and her legal team, I understood that tomorrow morning would reveal the full scope of Winston's final lesson about the difference between entitlement and inheritance. The next morning arrived with Portland's typical autumn drizzle, the kind of weather that made the city feel intimate and contemplative. I'd spent the night reviewing the documents Winston had entrusted to me, ensuring every detail was perfect for what was about to unfold. Caroline arrived at the offices of Crawford & Associates precisely at 9 a.m., her confidence radiating from every step as she entered the downtown building's marble lobby. She'd brought the same team of lawyers, plus 2 additional associates, clearly expecting this to be a routine matter of dividing Winston's estate according to her assumptions. "I appreciate you being reasonable about this," Caroline said as we rode the elevator to the 23rd floor. She was wearing a new designer dress, probably purchased in anticipation of her inheritance windfall. "I know Winston cared about you in his way, but family law is very clear about biological precedence." Her lead attorney, the silver-haired man from yesterday, nodded approvingly. "Your sister is being quite generous, Miss Mitchell. Many biological heirs would pursue full litigation to ensure adoptees receive nothing." I smiled politely, watching the floor numbers climb. They had no idea they were walking into James Crawford's office, where Winston's real estate empire was managed. Caroline had researched domestic probate law, but she'd never bothered to investigate international holdings or offshore trust structures. Crawford greeted us in his spacious office overlooking the Willamette River. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades structuring complex international transactions. His assistant served coffee in bone china cups while we settled around the conference table. "Before we begin," Crawford said, opening a thick file, "I want to ensure everyone understands the scope of Winston Mitchell's estate planning. There are domestic assets, which follow traditional probate procedures, and international holdings, which are governed by separate legal structures." Caroline's lawyer leaned forward eagerly. "We're prepared to handle any complications. Our research shows the estate consists primarily of the Lake Oswego residence, vintage automobile collection, and domestic investment portfolio valued at approximately $5 million. Crawford nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, those are the domestic assets. They will indeed go to Caroline as the biological heir, minus taxes and administrative fees." He paused, studying the papers before him. "However, that represents roughly 20% of Winston's total wealth." The room fell silent. Caroline's confident expression flickered, replaced by confusion. "What do you mean, 20%? Winston Mitchell built an extensive international real estate portfolio over the past 15 years. Crawford continued, his voice professionally neutral. Properties in London's financial district, commercial developments in Barcelona, luxury residential buildings in Singapore. The total value exceeds $20 million. One of Caroline's lawyers cleared his throat. "If these assets exist, they would still be subject to inheritance law. Biological precedents would apply." Crawford smiled slightly. "That would be true if the assets were part of Winston's estate. However, they were transferred to Rebecca Mitchell through a series of offshore trusts and international corporations 3 years ago. Winston maintained control during his lifetime through management agreements, but legal ownership transferred upon execution of the trust documents." I watched Caroline's face transform as the implications sank in. Her confidence crumbled, replaced by disbelief and growing panic. "That's impossible. He never mentioned any international properties to me." "Winston documented his reasons for the transfer quite thoroughly," Crawford said, pulling out another folder. He expressed concern about what he termed transactional family relationships, and wanted to ensure his wealth would be used responsibly rather than simply consumed. Caroline's lead attorney was frantically taking notes. "We'll need to review all documentation. If there's any evidence of undue influence or mental incapacity at the time of transfer, Crawford handed over a thick stack of documents. Medical records showing Winston's mental acuity throughout the transfer process. Psychological evaluations confirming his competence. Video recordings of him explaining his decisions. Audio recordings of conversations with Caroline that influenced his estate planning. As Caroline's team buried themselves in paperwork, I found myself thinking about all those afternoons in Winston's study, learning about international markets and responsible wealth management. He'd been preparing me not just to inherit his fortune, but to understand the weight of that responsibility. The audio recordings were devastating. Crawford played them with clinical precision, each conversation revealing another layer of Caroline's sense of entitlement and disregard for Winston's well-being. "This is from Caroline's birthday dinner 2 years ago," Crawford announced, pressing play on a digital recorder. Caroline's voice filled the room, young and careless. "Come on, Grandpa, it's just money. You can't take it with you, right? I deserve to enjoy life while I'm young." Caroline paled as she listened to her own words. That was taken out of context. I was just... The recording continued with Winston's gentle response. "I understand wanting to enjoy life, Caroline. But I wonder if you've ever thought about where this money comes from, or what happens when it's gone." Caroline's laugh on the recording was sharp and dismissive. "That's your job to worry about, not mine. I'm not some boring accountant like Rebecca." Crawford paused the playback. "Winston kept detailed records of family interactions for the past 5 years. Would you like to hear more?" The next recording was even worse. Caroline demanding money for a European vacation, growing angry when Winston suggested she might contribute something toward the cost herself. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult," her recorded voice complained. "You're rich. I'm your granddaughter. End of story." With each recording, Caroline's legal team grew quieter. Her behavior wasn't criminal, but it painted a clear picture of someone who viewed her grandfather as a source of funding rather than a person deserving respect and care. "These recordings span 3 years," Crawford explained. "They document a pattern of transactional interaction that troubled Winston deeply. He began to fear that leaving his wealth to Caroline would result in its rapid depletion through careless spending." In contrast, Crawford played recordings of my conversations with Winston, discussions about sustainable building practices, questions about his health, expressions of gratitude for his guidance. The difference was striking and undeniable. Winston often mentioned Rebecca's genuine interest in his well-being, Crawford noted. She was the only family member who ever asked about his doctor's appointments or offered to help with daily tasks as his health declined. Caroline's lead attorney was scrambling now, searching for any legal foothold. Even if the international transfers were legal, surely the emotional manipulation... "There was no manipulation," Crawford interrupted. Winston initiated the estate planning process independently. He consulted multiple attorneys, underwent psychiatric evaluation, and carefully considered his options over several years. He pulled out Winston's handwritten letter, his final explanation for his decisions. Crawford's voice was steady as he read, "I have learned that blood relation does not guarantee love, respect, or responsibility. Rebecca has shown me the kind of person I hope to have as my legacy. She understands that wealth is a trust to be stewarded, not a prize to be consumed." Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. You're telling me that some adopted stranger gets $20 million while I get table scraps?" "You're receiving the domestic estate," Crawford corrected. "After taxes and fees, approximately $4.2 million. Many people would consider that a substantial inheritance." But Caroline wasn't listening to reason anymore. Her face was flushed with rage and humiliation. She manipulated him. She spent years poisoning his mind against his real family. This has to be fraud. Crawford's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the distaste in his eyes. Winston's decision-making process is extensively documented. 3 independent attorneys reviewed the transfers. 2 medical professionals certified his mental competence. The structure is legally bulletproof." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Caroline's lawyers whispering urgently among themselves. They were realizing what I had understood from the beginning. Winston had planned this revelation carefully, ensuring that Caroline would learn about her sister's inheritance in the most humbling way possible. The final blow came when Crawford opened his laptop and displayed a video call from London. James Crawford Jr. appeared on screen from his office overlooking the Thames, surrounded by property documents and architectural plans. "Good morning, everyone," the younger Crawford said with crisp British efficiency. "I'm calling to confirm receipt of Rebecca's signed management agreements for the London portfolio. We're ready to proceed with the Barcelona expansion whenever she's prepared to visit the properties." Caroline stared at the screen in disbelief. "Barcelona expansion?" "The trust documents include provisions for growth," Crawford Sr. explained. Winston believed Rebecca would not only preserve his wealth, but build upon it responsibly. The international portfolio is structured to support continued development. I had remained silent through most of the meeting, but now I felt compelled to speak. "Caroline, I never wanted things to happen this way. Winston hoped you would show interest in something beyond his money. He waited for you to ask about his health, his interests, his life." Caroline's voice was hoarse with emotion. "You planned this. You turned him against me." "I spent time with him," I replied quietly. "I listened when he talked about his travels, his business experiences, his dreams for the future. You were always too busy or too bored to engage with anything that didn't involve immediate financial benefit." Crawford pulled out the final document, Winston's personal letter to Caroline. "He wanted you to receive this after learning about the international holdings." Caroline's hands shook as she read Winston's words. "My dear Caroline, I have left you well provided for, but I could not entrust my life's work to someone who sees money as entertainment rather than responsibility. Perhaps this disappointment will teach you what my love and patience could not, that relationships require more than biological connection. They require mutual respect, genuine care, and recognition that other people are more than sources of personal benefit." The letter continued with Winston's hopes for Caroline's future growth, but she crumpled it without finishing, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. Her lead attorney made one final attempt. "We reserve the right to challenge these transfers through international courts. We'll investigate every aspect of this arrangement." Crawford nodded politely. "That is certainly your right. However, I should mention that challenging the international trust would require litigation in 3 separate jurisdictions: London, Barcelona, and Singapore. The legal fees alone would likely exceed the value of Caroline's domestic inheritance." The mathematics of revenge were elegant in their simplicity. Winston had ensured that any attempt to contest his decisions would be financially ruinous for Caroline, while the international holdings remained safely beyond the reach of domestic courts. As Caroline's legal team packed their documents in defeat, she turned to me with eyes full of hurt and fury. "This isn't over, Rebecca. I'll find a way to prove you manipulated him." I met her gaze steadily. "Winston made his choice based on our behavior over many years. Nothing I could say or do would have changed that if you had shown him genuine love and respect. The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and final. Caroline had lost more than an inheritance. She had lost the respect of the grandfather who had tried to love her despite her selfishness." As the elevator doors closed on Caroline and her lawyers, I remained in Crawford's office, staring out at the Portland skyline. The city looked different somehow, full of possibilities I was only beginning to understand. "Winston would be proud," Crawford said softly. "He believed you would use his gift wisely." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. The international properties weren't just an inheritance. They were a trust, a legacy that demanded careful stewardship and thoughtful growth. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of my new London office, watching Caroline's final desperate attempt to overturn Winston's estate planning crumble into expensive failure. Her international legal challenge had consumed the entire domestic inheritance, leaving her with crushing debt, and no assets beyond her personal belongings. The British High Court's decision was unambiguous. The transfers were executed with full legal compliance and documented mental competence. The plaintiff has provided no evidence of fraud, coercion, or undue influence. Caroline had sold her car, her jewelry, and finally her apartment to fund the litigation. Her lawyers had warned her repeatedly about the costs, but her rage and sense of entitlement had driven her to pursue an unwinnable case across 3 continents. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bright Hollow Labs' European headquarters, I could see the Thames sparkling in the afternoon sunshine. Winston's London properties had tripled in value since the transfers, and the Barcelona development was already generating significant rental income. My assistant knocked softly on the door. "Miss Mitchell, Caroline is here. She's asking to speak with you." I found my sister in the reception area, looking haggard and defeated. Her designer clothes had been replaced by budget attire, and the confident arrogance that had defined her for so long was nowhere to be seen. "Rebecca," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from months of stress. "I need to talk to you." We sat in a small conference room overlooking the city. Caroline's hands trembled as she spoke. "I have lost everything. The court cases, the legal fees. I don't even have enough money for rent next month." I studied her face, seeing something I'd never witnessed before. Genuine remorse mixed with desperate fear. "What do you want me to say, Caroline?" "I was wrong," she whispered. "About you, about Grandpa, about everything. I thought family meant automatic entitlement, but I never tried to earn his love or respect. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old family bond we'd shared as children, before Caroline's sense of superiority had poisoned our relationship. Winston left me a letter, too," I said finally, pulling out the envelope I'd carried since his death. "He wrote it knowing you would challenge the inheritance, knowing you would lose everything in the process." Caroline's eyes widened as I read Winston's words. "Rebecca, if you are reading this to Caroline, it means she has learned the hard lesson I could not teach her through love alone. She is still my granddaughter, and I hope this experience will transform her understanding of what family truly means." The letter continued with Winston's instructions: a trust fund that would provide Caroline with basic living expenses, contingent on her demonstrating genuine change through community service and personal growth. "He never wanted you to be destroyed," I explained. "He wanted you to learn the difference between earning something and expecting it." Caroline broke down completely, months of suppressed grief and regret pouring out. "I was so focused on the money that I never saw how much he loved us both. I threw away his love for inheritance I didn't even deserve." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Winston believed people could change, Caroline. He hoped this experience would teach you what his generosity couldn't." Through tears, Caroline asked, "Is there any way? Could I work for you? Learn about the business? Prove that I can be more than just an entitled granddaughter?" I looked out at the London skyline, thinking about Winston's final wish for family reconciliation. "The Barcelona office needs an assistant property manager. Entry-level position, small salary, lots of learning opportunities." Caroline nodded eagerly. "I'll take it. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for giving me a chance to become someone Grandpa would have been proud of." As we sat together in the fading afternoon light, I realized that Winston's greatest victory wasn't teaching Caroline a lesson about entitlement. It was creating an opportunity for genuine family healing, built on respect rather than biological assumption. Caroline's attempted legal challenge had devastating consequences that extended far beyond financial ruin. Her public pursuit of an inheritance that belonged to another heir damaged her social reputation irreparably, as former friends and acquaintances learned about her entitled behavior toward Winston and her cruel treatment of her adopted sister. The London court's scathing decision was reported in legal journals across 3 continents, making her name synonymous with frivolous litigation and family greed. Her professional prospects evaporated when potential employers discovered her history of prioritizing money over relationships, and her dating life collapsed when men realized she had attempted to steal millions from her own sister. The stress of losing everything she had taken for granted aged her visibly, forcing her to confront the reality that her entire identity had been built on unearned privilege rather than personal accomplishment. Standing in my Barcelona office 2 years later, overseeing the expansion of Winston's carefully built empire, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a threatened inheritance to managing a global real estate portfolio worth over $50 million. The revenge had been complete, not because I had taken something from Caroline, but because Winston had used his wisdom to create consequences that would either destroy her or transform her into someone worthy of the family name. As I signed the contracts for our new Singapore development, I understood that the greatest victory was not in punishing those who had wronged me, but in proving myself worthy of the trust Winston had placed in my hands. Veronica deserves everything. You're worthless and always have been, my mother Frances declared, her voice cutting through the law office like a blade. I sat in the leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching her pace behind my sister with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt smaller with each passing second, the weight of her words pressing down on my chest like stones. My name is Judith, and at 29 years old, I had spent most of my life being reminded that I was the disappointment, the burden, the daughter who never quite measured up. Veronica, 3 years younger and perpetually golden in our mother's eyes, sat primly beside Frances, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table in anticipation. The lawyers were running 10 minutes late, but Frances couldn't contain her excitement any longer. Rose always knew Veronica was special, Frances continued, her eyes gleaming with vindictive satisfaction. Beautiful, charming, everything a grandmother could want in a granddaughter. You were just there, an obligation. I felt the familiar sting of her words, but something deeper, a quiet strength I had cultivated over years of managing Grandma Rose's affairs, kept me steady. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time until the moment that would change everything. Frances had no idea what was coming, and I found myself almost grateful for her cruelty. It would make what happened next feel like justice rather than revenge. I can't wait to redecorate Grandma's house, Veronica said dreamily, already planning her inheritance. Those antiques are so outdated. I'm thinking modern minimalist, maybe some of those expensive Italian fixtures I saw in the magazine. Frances beamed with pride. Whatever you want, darling. Rose's savings account should cover renovations easily. $20,000 goes quite far when you're smart about spending. I watched them discuss their plans, feeling like a ghost in my own family. They spoke about Grandma Rose's house, her jewelry collection, her modest savings account with such certainty, such entitlement. Not once did they mention the 3 years I had spent visiting Rose every Tuesday and Thursday, helping her organize her papers, listening to her stories, learning about the business investments she had carefully hidden from my mother's gambling addiction. The door handle turned, and I straightened in my chair. The lawyers had arrived, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested this reading would be anything but routine. Frances smoothed her hair and adjusted her jacket, preparing to collect what she believed was rightfully Veronica's. What my mother didn't know was that Grandma Rose had been far more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for, and infinitely more wealthy than my family had ever imagined. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with a careful dance between my grandmother and me, one that my mother and sister had been too self-absorbed to notice. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years, I had driven the 45 minutes from my apartment in downtown Minneapolis to Grandma Rose's modest house in the suburbs, ostensibly to help her with household tasks and provide companionship in her later years. What actually happened during those visits was far more complex. Rose would brew her signature chamomile tea, settle into her favorite armchair, and begin discussing her little projects, business investments she had been making for over 2 decades. Most people saw Rose as a sweet elderly woman living on Social Security, and a small pension from her late husband's factory job. The reality was that she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, ranging from a successful catering business to a small but profitable real estate development firm. "Frances has a problem, Judith," Rose had confided in me during one of our early conversations. "I've watched her gamble away 3 different windfall payments over the years. Her father's life insurance, the settlement from her car accident, even the money I gave her for Veronica's college fund. All of it disappeared into those casino machines. I had suspected as much. Frances's frequent business trips to nearby casinos, her mood swings that coincided with mysterious financial stress, and her constant requests for loans from Rose had painted a clear picture. What I hadn't realized was how methodically Rose had been protecting her assets from my mother's addiction. "I need someone I can trust to help me manage these investments," Rose had said, sliding a folder across her kitchen table. "Someone who won't see dollar signs and forget about responsibility." The folder contained corporate documents, financial statements, and partnership agreements worth approximately $15 million. Rose had spent decades quietly building this business empire, reinvesting profits and expanding her holdings, while maintaining the facade of a simple retiree. She had chosen me as her successor not out of favoritism, but out of necessity. Frances's gambling debts had put creditors on alert, and they were already sniffing around Rose's estate, hoping to collect when she passed. "Your mother believes I have $20,000 in savings and a house worth maybe $150,000, Rose had explained with a slight smile. "Let her continue believing that. These businesses need protection from her creditors, and more importantly, they need someone who understands their value." I had spent those 3 years learning every aspect of Rose's investments, meeting with corporate attorneys, and ensuring that the business succession would be legally airtight. Frances and Veronica had occasionally made snide comments about my charity work with Rose, never bothering to ask what we actually discussed during our long afternoons together. Now, as the lawyers settled into their chairs and began arranging documents, I felt the weight of those secret conversations. Rose's plan was about to unfold exactly as she had designed it, and my mother's cruelty would finally come with a price she never could have imagined. Mr. Harrison, the primary estate attorney, was a distinguished man in his 60s who had worked with Rose for over 15 years. He cleared his throat and opened the official will document, his reading glasses perched carefully on his nose. Frances and Veronica leaned forward eagerly, while I remained composed, my heart beating steadily as the moment approached. "The last will and testament of Rose Elizabeth Thompson," Mr. Harrison began formally. "I, Rose Elizabeth Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my worldly possessions as follows." Frances gripped Veronica's hand, both women barely containing their excitement. They had been anticipating this moment for months, ever since Rose's health had begun declining. I watched them with a mixture of sadness and determination, knowing that their joy would be short-lived, but necessary. To my granddaughter Veronica, I leave my family home at 1247 Elm Street, including all furnishings, fixtures, and personal belongings contained within. Additionally, I bequeath to Veronica my complete jewelry collection and the contents of my savings account at First National Bank. Veronica squealed with delight, her hands flying to her mouth in theatrical surprise. Frances began crying tears of what appeared to be gratitude, though I suspected they were tears of relief at securing what she believed would solve her mounting debts. They embraced dramatically, while Mr. Harrison continued reading the formal language of the bequest. "The jewelry alone must be worth $30,000, Frances whispered loudly to Veronica. "And that house is in such a desirable neighborhood now." I felt a familiar pang of exclusion as they celebrated, but it was quickly replaced by anticipation. Rose had warned me that this moment would be difficult, that watching them receive what they believed was everything would test my resolve. She had been right. Seeing their triumphant faces, hearing their immediate plans to liquidate Rose's memory for cash, made my chest tighten with grief and anger. "To my granddaughter Judith," Mr. Harrison continued, "I leave my collection of business documents and corporate files housed in the filing cabinet in my home office. Francis actually laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the conference room. Business documents? What business documents? Mother never had any business besides collecting Social Security. Veronica giggled along with her mother. Poor Judith gets the boring paperwork while I get the house and jewelry. I guess that's fitting. They exchanged a look of shared amusement, their cruelty casual and automatic. I absorbed their mockery without reaction, knowing that their laughter would turn to something very different within the next few minutes. Rose's plan was working perfectly. They were so convinced of their victory that they wouldn't see the reversal coming until it was too late. Mr. Harrison closed the will and set it aside, but he made no move to conclude the meeting. Instead, he looked directly at me with an expression that suggested the real business was just beginning. As Francis and Veronica continued their whispered celebration, a second attorney entered the conference room. Margaret Kowalski was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who specialized in corporate law, and her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. She carried a thick briefcase and wore the kind of confident expression that suggested she held information that would change everything. "Ladies," Mr. Harrison said, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Kowalski from Silver Pine Holdings. She has some additional documents that pertain to Rose's estate." Frances barely looked up from her conversation with Veronica about redecorating plans. Additional documents. What kind of additional documents? The will was very clear. Margaret settled into her chair and opened her briefcase with deliberate precision. Mr. Harrison is correct that the will addresses Rose's personal property, her home, jewelry, and savings account. However, those items represent only a small fraction of Rose's total assets. Veronica's head snapped up from her phone, where she had been texting friends about her inheritance. "What do you mean, small fraction? Grandma wasn't wealthy. She lived in that tiny house and drove that old car." "Rose Thompson was indeed very wealthy," Margaret replied calmly. "She simply chose to live modestly while building a substantial business empire. For the past 22 years, she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, managed through a complex but legal corporate structure designed to protect her assets." The color began draining from Frances's face. "Business empire. That's impossible. My mother worked at the post office for 30 years and then retired. She never mentioned any businesses." I watched my mother's confidence start to crumble as Margaret spread corporate documents across the conference table. The papers bore Rose's signature, notarized dates going back decades, and financial statements that showed profits in the millions. Frances picked up one document with trembling fingers, scanning the numbers with growing horror. "These companies," Margaret continued, "include North Peak Engineering, a civil engineering firm that has contracted with the State Highway Department for 15 years, Rainmore Publishing, which owns the rights to several successful regional magazines, Jasper Hollow Foods, a catering company that services major corporate events throughout the Twin Cities, Oxbend Technologies, a small but profitable software development firm, and Larkspur and Finch, a real estate development partnership that has built 3 successful residential communities." Veronica's face had gone pale. How much are these companies worth?" "The combined value, based on the most recent appraisals, is approximately $15 million. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Frances made a small choking sound, while Veronica gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Their celebration had transformed into stunned silence, replaced by the dawning realization that they had been operating under completely false assumptions about Rose's wealth. "Where did the money come from?" Frances whispered. "How could she afford to buy businesses?" Margaret consulted her notes. "Rose began investing in 2002, using your father's life insurance settlement as initial capital. Instead of spending that money, she partnered with existing business owners who needed investors. Over time, she acquired controlling interests through careful reinvestment of profits. She was, by all accounts, an extremely shrewd businesswoman. I watched my mother's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and growing dread. Frances had always dismissed Rose as a simple woman who needed taking care of, never recognizing the sharp intelligence that had built an empire right under everyone's noses. The condescension Frances had shown toward Rose's little hobbies was now revealed as willful blindness to her mother's remarkable success. "But why didn't she tell us?" Veronica demanded. "Why keep it secret?" Margaret's expression grew serious. Rose was very concerned about protecting these assets from potential creditors. She had observed certain gambling habits within the family and wanted to ensure that her business empire would remain intact. Frances's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The carefully hidden truth about her addiction was now exposed in front of lawyers and documented in corporate files that could never be denied or dismissed. Margaret reached into her briefcase and withdrew another set of documents, these ones bearing more recent dates and signatures. Rose updated her corporate succession plan 18 months ago, after careful consideration of who should inherit control of these businesses. Frances lunged forward in her chair. "Veronica is her primary heir. The will clearly states—" "The will addresses Rose's personal property," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Corporate ownership operates under different legal structures. These businesses were never part of her personal estate. They were held in trust, with designated successors chosen based on Rose's assessment of their business acumen and financial responsibility." I felt my heart rate increase as the moment approached. For 3 years I had known this day would come, but experiencing it felt surreal. Frances and Veronica were about to learn that their assumptions about family hierarchy meant nothing in the face of Rose's careful planning. "Who inherits the businesses?" Veronica asked, her voice strained with anxiety. Margaret turned to face me directly. "Judith Thompson has been designated as the primary successor for all 5 companies. She has been working closely with Rose for the past 3 years, learning the operations and meeting with management teams. The transition is designed to be seamless." The silence that followed was deafening. Frances stared at me as if seeing a stranger, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Veronica's perfect composure shattered completely, her face contorting with disbelief and fury. "That's impossible," Frances finally managed to say. "Judith doesn't know anything about business. She's never shown any interest in—" "Actually," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the lawyers had arrived, "I've been learning about these companies for 3 years. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I visited Grandma Rose, we went over financial reports, met with managers, and discussed long-term strategy. She was an incredible teacher." Veronica's eyes filled with tears of rage. "You knew? You knew about the money this whole time and said nothing?" "Rose asked me to keep the businesses confidential until after her death," I replied calmly. "She was concerned about protecting them from outside interference." Frances's face twisted with understanding. "Outside interference? You mean my debts?" Margaret nodded. Rose was very explicit about her concerns. She had observed multiple instances where family resources were lost to gambling debts, and she wanted to ensure that her business empire remained stable and productive. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Frances realized that not only had she underestimated her own mother's wealth and intelligence, but that her gambling addiction had cost her family access to millions of dollars. Her years of condescension toward Rose, her dismissal of Rose's boring conversations about investments, had blinded her to the empire that was being built right in front of her. $15 million, Veronica whispered, as if saying the number might make it less real. $15 million, and you get all of it? I inherited the responsibility of managing these companies, I corrected. Rose built something remarkable, and she trusted me to continue her work. Frances stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't fair. Veronica is the primary heir. There has to be some way to contest this. Margaret's expression remained professional but firm. The corporate succession has been legally established for years. Every document has been properly notarized, witnessed, and filed with appropriate authorities. Rose worked with multiple attorneys to ensure there would be no grounds for contest. The trap Rose had laid was perfect in its simplicity. She had given Frances and Veronica exactly what they expected while protecting what truly mattered from their potential interference. Frances began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal, her earlier triumph now transformed into desperate calculation. There has to be something we can do. Some legal challenge. Some way to prove that Mother wasn't in her right mind when she made these arrangements. Margaret opened another folder with practiced efficiency. Rose anticipated such concerns. She underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months ago, specifically to demonstrate her mental competency. The results show her cognitive function was well above average for her age group. I watched my mother's face as each avenue of denial was systematically closed off. Rose had thought of everything, spending years building legal barriers that would protect her businesses from the very scenario that was unfolding now. Frances's gambling addiction, her pattern of viewing family resources as her own personal bank account, had finally met an obstacle she couldn't manipulate or overcome. But the house, Veronica said desperately. At least I still have the house and jewelry. That's something. Margaret consulted her notes with an expression that suggested more bad news. Unfortunately, there are some complications regarding those assets as well. Rose's creditors have been monitoring the estate, and there are significant liens against both the property and the jewelry collection. Frances's face went white. Liens? What liens? Your gambling debts, Frances. Several casinos have obtained judgments against you over the past 2 years. They've been waiting for Rose's estate to settle so they could collect against any inherited assets. The house and jewelry will need to be liquidated to satisfy those obligations. The final piece of Rose's protection strategy became clear. She had known that any assets left to Veronica would ultimately end up in Frances's hands, and from there would be seized by creditors. By giving Veronica the house and jewelry, Rose had effectively given her nothing, worse than nothing, since Veronica would now be responsible for the legal proceedings required to transfer the assets to the casinos. Veronica collapsed back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. So I get nothing? Nothing at all? You'll receive whatever remains after the creditors are satisfied, Mr. Harrison said gently. Unfortunately, given the value of the liens versus the appraised value of the property and jewelry, there's unlikely to be any significant remainder. Frances turned to face me with an expression of pure hatred. You planned this. You manipulated her into cutting us out. I helped Grandma Rose manage her businesses, I replied steadily. Everything else was her decision, based on her observations of this family over many years. This isn't over, Frances snarled. I'll find a way to fight this. I'll prove that you influenced her, that you took advantage of an elderly woman. Margaret's voice cut through Frances's threats with professional authority. I should mention that Rose documented her reasoning extensively. She kept detailed records of family interactions, including recordings of conversations where gambling debts were discussed. She also documented instances where family members made disparaging comments about her intelligence or business acumen. The recordings. I remembered Rose's small digital recorder, which she had started using after Frances made particularly cruel comments about Rose's supposed senility. My grandmother had been building a legal defense against exactly the kind of challenge Frances was threatening to mount. Frances sank into her chair, the fight draining out of her as she realized the scope of Rose's preparation. Every contingency had been considered, every possible objection anticipated and countered. Rose had spent 3 years not just teaching me about her businesses, but building an unassailable legal fortress around the succession plan. The woman my family had dismissed as a simple retiree had outmaneuvered them completely, ensuring that her life's work would be protected from the very people who had taken her generosity for granted. I reached into my purse and withdrew a sealed envelope that Rose had given me 6 months before her death. Grandma Rose asked me to give this to both of you after the legal proceedings were complete. Frances and Veronica stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Their faces bore the hollow expressions of people who had just watched their entire worldview collapse. With trembling fingers, Frances opened the envelope and unfolded the handwritten letter inside. My dear Frances and Veronica, Frances read aloud, her voice breaking. If you are reading this, then my business empire has been revealed, and you understand the true scope of what you have lost. I want you to know that this was not a decision I made lightly. Veronica leaned over to read along, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Frances continued reading, her voice growing smaller with each word. Frances, your gambling addiction has cost this family more than you realize. The money you asked me for over the years, the loans you never repaid, came from profits these businesses generated. I calculated that your debts have cost the family over $200,000 in the past 5 years alone. Frances's hands shook as she held the letter. She kept track? Veronica, Frances read on. You have never shown interest in anything beyond spending money and acquiring material possessions. When I tried to discuss my investments with you, you dismissed them as boring old lady hobbies. You made it clear that you saw me as nothing more than a source of inheritance. Veronica sobbed openly now, the weight of her grandmother's disappointment finally reaching her. Judith, on the other hand, spent 3 years learning about these businesses, not because she wanted to inherit them, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being and respected my intelligence. She never asked me for money, never dismissed my accomplishments, and never treated me like a burden. Frances finished reading the letter, her voice barely a whisper. I leave these businesses to Judith because she has earned them through dedication, respect, and genuine love. What you inherit, or fail to inherit, is the result of choices you made over many years. I hope you learn from this experience, though I fear you may not. Love, Mother. The conference room fell silent except for Veronica's quiet crying. Frances stared at the letter for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it back in the envelope. When she looked up at me, her expression had changed from anger to something closer to defeat. She really planned all of this, Frances said quietly. Every detail. Yes, I replied. She spent 3 years making sure everything would be legally protected and properly documented. Margaret began packing her documents. Judith, you'll need to meet with the management teams of each company within the next 2 weeks. The transition plans are already in place, but there are some signatures required to finalize the transfers. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Rose had prepared me well for this moment, but actually becoming the owner of 5 successful companies felt surreal. I'll make time in my schedule. Frances stood up slowly, moving like someone much older than her 54 years. I suppose congratulations are in order. You played this very well. I didn't play anything, I said firmly. I loved Grandma Rose, and she recognized that love. Everything else followed from there. Veronica finally looked up from her hands. What happens now? What are we supposed to do? You'll need to work with your mother's creditors to liquidate the inherited assets, Mr. Harrison explained. The process will take several months, but it should satisfy the outstanding debts. And after that? Veronica asked. After that, you'll need to build your own lives, I said, not unkindly. Grandma Rose gave you the same gift she gave me, the opportunity to learn from your mistakes. What you do with that opportunity is up to you. Frances gathered her purse and stood to leave. I suppose we won't be seeing much of each other anymore. That depends, I replied. The door is always open if you're ready to build a different kind of relationship. But the days of taking family for granted are over. Frances and Veronica discovered that the gambling debts had grown far beyond what they initially realized, with compound interest and legal fees bringing the total owed to nearly $400,000. The house and jewelry, after appraisals and legal costs, barely covered 2/3 of the debt, leaving Frances personally liable for the remainder and forcing her into bankruptcy. Veronica, now responsible for her mother's financial choices, lost her credit rating and social standing when the bankruptcy became public record, while their extended family and social circle learned the full scope of the gambling addiction that had cost them millions. Both women were forced to find employment for the first time in years, working entry-level positions while I managed a business empire worth $15 million. A daily reminder of how their cruelty and entitlement had cost them everything. Looking back on that day in the conference room, I realized that Grandma Rose had given me more than just financial security. She had taught me that true power comes from earning respect rather than demanding it, and that the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own choices. The company inheritance goes to blood relatives only, not outsiders, Aunt Patricia announced at our Thanksgiving dinner, her voice cutting through the warm chatter like a knife through butter. She raised her wine glass with theatrical flair, her eyes scanning the table for approval from our extended family gathered in Phoenix, Arizona. Smith Enterprises has been built by real family members, and it will stay that way. The dining room fell silent, except for the gentle clinking of silverware against china. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly from his seat at the head of the table, while my cousins Jessica and Brandon exchanged satisfied glances. Even my adoptive parents, who had brought me into this family 25 years ago, seemed uncomfortable, but said nothing. My name is Martha Collins, and at 28 years old, I had learned to navigate these family gatherings with careful composure. I smiled politely and took a sip of my sparkling cider, letting Patricia's words wash over me like water off a duck's back. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, at least not yet. I mean, we can't have just anyone thinking they're entitled to what we've worked so hard to build, Patricia continued, her gaze settling on me with barely concealed disdain. Some people need to understand their place in this family. I felt the familiar sting of exclusion, but I had grown accustomed to it over the years. Being adopted into the Smith family had always come with an asterisk, a constant reminder that I wasn't quite one of them, despite sharing their name and sitting at their table every holiday. Patricia makes an excellent point, chimed in my cousin Jessica, who worked as marketing director at Smith Enterprises. The company has thrived because we keep it in the family. We understand the business in ways that outsiders simply cannot. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the wisdom of her words. You're absolutely right, Jessica. Family loyalty is everything in business. What they couldn't see was the quiet confidence I carried, the secret knowledge that had been growing inside me for the past 5 years, like a seed waiting for the right moment to bloom. As I listened to their self-congratulatory speeches about bloodlines and belonging, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing that their entire world was built on foundations far more fragile than they could ever imagine. The evening ended with Patricia's final proclamation. When the time comes to discuss inheritance and succession planning, we'll make sure everything goes to the right people, real family members who have earned their place. The drive home from Phoenix to my apartment in Scottsdale gave me time to reflect on the evening's events. Patricia's words echoed in my mind, but they no longer carried the power to wound me as they once had. Instead, they served as a reminder of how much had changed since my grandmother's passing 5 years ago. My maternal grandmother, Helen Morrison, had been the one person in my life who truly understood me. She had watched from the sidelines as the Smith family treated me like a perpetual guest rather than a daughter, and she had made her displeasure known in the most practical way possible, through her will. When grandmother Helen died, she left me her entire estate, $75 million accumulated through decades of shrewd investments in real estate and technology stocks. The inheritance had been a complete shock to everyone, including me. Helen had lived modestly, and no one suspected the true extent of her wealth. Use this wisely, Martha, her letter had said. You have a brilliant mind for business, and I trust you to make decisions that honor both your intelligence and your character. At 23, I had been overwhelmed by the responsibility and the opportunity. I could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, or lived lavishly for the rest of my life. Instead, I had made a decision that would prove far more satisfying in the long run. Smith Enterprises had been struggling at the time. The manufacturing company that Patricia's grandfather had founded was facing serious financial difficulties, caught between rising costs and declining orders. The family had been desperately seeking investors, though they had been careful to keep their troubles quiet to maintain their social standing. I had approached my financial advisor, Douglas Whitman, with a proposal. I want to invest anonymously in Smith Enterprises, set up shell companies and legal trusts to hide my identity completely. Douglas had raised his eyebrows. That's a significant risk, Martha. Why would you want to help a company that might fail? Because sometimes the best investments are the ones that no one else believes in, I had replied, though my real motivation was far more complex. Through a carefully constructed network of holding companies and offshore trusts, I had invested the entire $75 million in Smith Enterprises. The injection of capital had saved the company from bankruptcy and allowed it to modernize its operations, expand its product line, and return to profitability. The family had celebrated their salvation, attributing it to their hard work and business acumen, rather than acknowledging the mysterious foreign investor who had appeared just when they needed it most. They had no idea that their savior was sitting at their Thanksgiving table, listening to them declare her unworthy of inheritance. The next morning, I sat in my home office, reviewing the quarterly reports that had arrived from Douglas's firm. The numbers told a story of remarkable success. Smith Enterprises had not only recovered from its near bankruptcy, but had grown into one of the most profitable manufacturing companies in the Southwest. My $75 million investment had grown to control 51% of the company's shares, making me the majority owner. I picked up my phone and dialed Douglas's direct line. Good morning, Douglas. I hope you had a pleasant Thanksgiving. Martha? Yes, thank you. I trust yours was enlightening? Douglas had been managing my investments long enough to understand the family dynamics at play. Very much so. In fact, I'm calling because I've made a decision about my Smith Enterprises holdings. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Oh, what kind of decision? I want to begin the process of withdrawing my entire investment, all $75 million plus accumulated returns. The silence stretched longer this time. Martha, are you certain? That's going to create significant financial disruption for the company. They've become dependent on that capital. I'm completely certain. How quickly can we execute the withdrawal? Given the size of the investment and the legal structures we put in place, I'd estimate 30 to 60 days for a complete liquidation. But Martha, this will likely force the company into bankruptcy. Is that really what you want? I looked out my office window at the Arizona desert landscape, where saguaro cacti stood tall and resilient, despite the harsh environment. Sometimes, Douglas, people need to learn that they can't build their success on the backs of people they claim don't belong. I see. And what would you like me to do with the proceeds once we've liquidated? I've been researching competing companies in the manufacturing sector. There's a firm called West Park Industries in Denver that's been looking for investment capital to expand operations. They've built their success on merit-based promotion and inclusive hiring practices. I think my money would be much better invested there. Douglas chuckled softly. I have to admit, Martha, I've been wondering when you'd decide to make this move. I'll begin preparing the withdrawal documentation immediately. Thank you, Douglas. And please make sure that when Smith Enterprises receives the withdrawal notice, they understand it's coming from their majority shareholder. I want them to know exactly who's been keeping their company afloat all these years. Consider it done. I'll draft a letter that makes your ownership position crystal clear. After ending the call, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Patricia and the family were about to learn a valuable lesson about the difference between being born into privilege and actually earning it. Their comfortable world of assumed inheritance and blood-based entitlement was about to crumble, and this time, I wouldn't be there to catch them when they fell. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. I knew about it before any of the family members did, thanks to the corporate governance documents that guaranteed my right as majority shareholder to attend all board meetings. Douglas had delivered the withdrawal notice the previous Friday afternoon, and the family had spent the weekend in frantic phone calls and desperate strategizing. I arrived at the Smith Enterprises headquarters building 30 minutes early, wearing my best navy blue business suit and carrying a leather portfolio containing copies of all the documentation proving my ownership stake. The receptionist, Kelly, greeted me with surprise. Martha, I didn't expect to see you here today. Are you here to see someone? I'm here for the board meeting, I replied calmly. Kelly's confusion was evident. But the board meeting is for executives and investors only. I don't think... I understand. Could you please let them know that Martha Collins has arrived and is ready to take her seat at the table? Before Kelly could respond, Patricia burst through the lobby doors, her usually perfect hair disheveled and her face pale with stress. She was followed by Robert, Jessica, and Brandon, all looking like they hadn't slept in days. "Kelly, has anyone from Morrison Holdings called?" Patricia demanded, completely ignoring my presence. "We need to reach their representatives immediately." I cleared my throat. "Actually, Patricia, Morrison Holdings is already here." Patricia whirled around, her eyes wide with desperation. "Martha, what are you talking about? This is a crisis situation. Our biggest investor is pulling out, and we need to find them before the company collapses." "I'm aware of the situation," I said quietly. "You're aware? How could you possibly be aware? This is confidential company business." Patricia's voice rose to a near shriek. Uncle Robert stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "Martha, this isn't the time for family games. We're facing bankruptcy because some foreign corporation has decided to destroy our company. We need all hands on deck to save Smith Enterprises." I opened my portfolio and extracted a document bearing the official seal of Morrison Holdings. "Actually, Uncle Robert, I think you'll find this situation more manageable than you imagine." Patricia snatched the document from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal text with growing disbelief. This says Morrison Holdings is... But that's impossible." "What does it say?" Jessica demanded, leaning over her mother's shoulder. Patricia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "It says Morrison Holdings is a subsidiary of Collins Family Trust, which is controlled by..." She looked up at me with horror dawning in her eyes. "Martha Collins." The lobby fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Brandon stared at me as if I had suddenly sprouted wings. Jessica grabbed the document from her mother's trembling hands and read it again, hoping the words would somehow change. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Robert finally managed. "Martha works as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit. She drives a Honda Civic. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment." "2 bedrooms, actually," I corrected gently. "And I prefer to live modestly. It helps people show their true colors when they think you don't have anything they want." Patricia's face had gone from pale to bright red. "You're telling me that you, an adopted nobody, have been our major investor this entire time?" "Majority investor," I clarified. "I own 51% of Smith Enterprises. I have for the past 5 years." The boardroom had never felt smaller than it did that Tuesday morning as I took my seat at the head of the conference table. Patricia, Robert, Jessica, and Brandon sat across from me like defendants awaiting sentencing, while the company's attorney, David Sherman, shuffled through documents with increasingly worried expressions. "This is absolutely impossible," Patricia kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "You can't own our company. You don't know anything about business." I opened my portfolio again and spread out 5 years' worth of quarterly reports, financial statements, and strategic recommendations that I had submitted through Douglas's firm. "Actually, Patricia, I think you'll find that I know quite a bit about this business. After all, I've been making the major financial decisions for half a decade." David Sherman looked up from his legal review. "I've verified the documentation. Miss Collins is indeed the majority shareholder of Smith Enterprises through a complex but entirely legal structure of holding companies and trusts." "But where did she get $75 million? Jessica demanded. "She can't possibly have that kind of money." "My grandmother left me her estate when she passed away 5 years ago," I explained. "She had been quite successful with her investments over the years, though she preferred to live quietly." Robert's face was turning purple with rage. "Helen Morrison? That woman left you everything. We're family. We deserve that inheritance. Are we family, Uncle Robert? I asked softly. Because yesterday at Thanksgiving, I was told quite clearly that I'm an outsider who doesn't belong. I was informed that inheritance should only go to blood relatives, not people like me. Patricia slammed her hand on the table. This is blackmail. You can't destroy our company just because your feelings got hurt. I'm not destroying anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply withdrawing my investment from a company whose leadership has made it clear that I'm not welcome. Surely you can understand that I'd prefer to invest my money with people who value my contributions. Brandon spoke up for the first time, his voice cracking with panic. But Martha, if you pull out, we'll lose everything. The company will go bankrupt. We'll all lose our jobs. That's unfortunate, I acknowledged. But according to yesterday's conversation, this company belongs to blood relatives only. I'm sure you'll find a way to manage without an outsider's money. The room fell silent as the full impact of the situation sank in. Smith Enterprises had been operating on borrowed time for years, propped up by my anonymous investment. Without that financial foundation, the company would collapse within weeks. David Sherman cleared his throat nervously. Miss Collins, is there any possibility of negotiation? Perhaps we could restructure the ownership arrangement or— I'm afraid not, I interrupted. I've already identified a new investment opportunity that aligns better with my values. West Park Industries in Denver has an excellent reputation for treating all employees with respect and promoting based on merit rather than family connections. Patricia's eyes filled with tears of rage and desperation. You're destroying 3 generations of family legacy out of spite. I'm not destroying anything, Aunt Patricia. I'm simply choosing to invest my money with people who treat me as a valued partner rather than an unwelcome intruder. Isn't that what any smart businesswoman would do? The final documents were signed in Douglas's office the following Thursday afternoon. Patricia and Robert had spent the intervening days making increasingly desperate phone calls, trying to find alternative investors or convince me to reconsider. Their efforts had been unsuccessful, largely because word had spread through Phoenix's business community about their treatment of their own majority shareholder. No investor wants to work with people who don't even know who owns their company, Douglas had explained to me during one of our phone calls. It suggests a fundamental lack of competence and awareness. As I watched Douglas transfer my shares to West Park Industries, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The satisfaction came from finally standing up for myself after years of polite acceptance of their contempt. The sadness came from realizing that my adoptive family had never truly seen me as one of them, despite 25 years of trying to earn their acceptance. The transfer is complete, Douglas announced, handing me a final set of documents. West Park Industries now owns 51% of Smith Enterprises, and you own 20% of West Park Industries. Your net worth has actually increased significantly through this transaction. I smiled at the irony. By trying to exclude me from their family business, Patricia and the others had actually made me wealthier and given me a stake in a much more successful company. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. Please reconsider. We can work something out. Family means everything. I showed the message to Douglas, who shook his head in amazement. After everything they said, they still don't understand what they've lost. They understand perfectly, I replied. They just thought I'd never have the power to do anything about it. That evening, I received a call from James Morrison, the CEO of West Park Industries. His voice was warm and professional as he introduced himself and explained his company's vision for the future. Miss Collins, I want you to know how excited we are to have you as a partner. Your investment will allow us to expand our operations significantly and create hundreds of new jobs. I'm looking forward to working with you, Mr. Morrison. I believe in investing in companies that value all their stakeholders. That's exactly the kind of partnership we want to build. In fact, I'd like to invite you to join our board of directors. Your business acumen and investment experience would be invaluable. After ending the call, I sat in my living room looking out at the Phoenix skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago, I had been a grieving granddaughter who inherited more money than she knew what to do with. Today, I was a successful businesswoman who had learned to value herself enough to walk away from people who didn't appreciate her worth. My phone rang again. This time it was Jessica, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Martha, please. Mom's in the hospital. The stress of losing the company gave her a heart attack. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us?" I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for Patricia's medical condition, but I also knew that forgiveness and business were separate matters. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother's health, Jessica. I hope she recovers quickly. But my investment decision isn't about forgiveness. It's about choosing to work with people who see me as a valuable partner, rather than an unwelcome burden." The bankruptcy filing for Smith Enterprises made the front page of the Phoenix Business Journal 2 weeks later. The headline read, "Family Manufacturing Dynasty Collapses After Alienating Majority Shareholder." The article detailed how the Smith family had unknowingly driven away their own financial backer through years of dismissive treatment. I read the article over my morning coffee, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and melancholy. The reporter had interviewed several business experts who used the Smith family's downfall as a cautionary tale about the importance of knowing who actually controls your company. "This is one of the most preventable corporate disasters I've seen in 30 years, one analyst was quoted as saying. Basic due diligence would have revealed the ownership structure, but they were so focused on family politics that they ignored fundamental business realities. My phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from business magazines and television programs. Everyone wanted to hear the story of the adopted daughter who had secretly owned the family company for 5 years. I had declined most of the requests, preferring to let my actions speak for themselves. Douglas called that morning with an update on the final dissolution of Smith Enterprises. "The assets are being liquidated to pay creditors," he reported. "Patricia and Robert will lose their executive salaries, their company cars, and their stock options. The family's financial situation is going to change dramatically." "And the employees?" I asked. "West Park Industries has offered positions to most of the skilled workers. They'll actually be better off in the long run, working for a company with stronger financial foundations and better management practices." I felt relieved knowing that innocent employees wouldn't suffer for their boss's mistakes. 6 months later, I stood in the boardroom of West Park Industries in Denver, presenting my first quarterly report as a board member. The room was filled with people who valued expertise over bloodlines, merit over family connections. James Morrison listened intently to my analysis, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about market trends and growth opportunities. "Your insights have been invaluable, Martha," he said after my presentation. "The Phoenix manufacturing facility is exceeding all our projections, and your recommendations for operational improvements have increased efficiency by 23%. As I drove back to my new home in Denver, a modest but comfortable house in a neighborhood where people knew me for my work rather than my family history, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I no longer had to endure holiday dinners filled with subtle insults and constant reminders of my outsider status. Instead, I spent my time with colleagues who appreciated my contributions and friends who valued my character over my bank account. My phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. Even months later, she occasionally tried to contact me, alternating between apologies and accusations. This message read, "I hope you're happy now that you've destroyed everything our family built." I deleted the message without responding. Patricia still didn't understand that I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped propping up their illusion of success. They had built their company on borrowed money and borrowed time, thinking their family name was sufficient to guarantee prosperity. The truth was, I had given them 5 years of financial stability that they never would have had without my investment. If they had chosen to treat me as family instead of as an intruder, we all could have prospered together. Instead, they had chosen pride over profit, prejudice over partnership. Patricia and the rest of the Smith family faced complete financial ruin when my withdrawal of $75 million forced Smith Enterprises into immediate bankruptcy, resulting in the loss of their company, family estate, and lifetime financial security within 30 days. Their reputation in the business community was destroyed when word spread that they had alienated their own controlling shareholder through petty prejudice, making them unemployable and socially ostracized in their formerly prestigious circles. Patricia lost her country club memberships, luxury car, and family home when creditors seized all assets to pay company debts, while other family members were forced to take minimum wage jobs after their executive positions disappeared with the company's collapse. The business press covered their downfall as a cautionary tale about family hubris and the importance of knowing who actually controls your company, ensuring their names would forever be associated with one of the most preventable corporate disasters in recent history. As I signed the final documents transferring my shares to West Park Industries, I understood that sometimes the most elegant revenge is simply letting prejudiced people discover the true cost of their discrimination when it destroys everything they thought they owned. And I realized that my journey from excluded outsider to respected business leader had taught me that real family isn't defined by blood, but by how people choose to treat each other when they think no one is watching.